My wife's brother had no idea I owned the house they lived in. You're a pathetic, lazy, and poor man that depends on his wife for everything. Get out, he shouted. I burst out laughing. Try to make me. He called the police, but when they saw my deed, he had to leave. You know how they say no good deed goes unpunished? Yeah, well, I should have listened to whoever came up with that gem. But here's the thing about being married to someone like Sienna. When she gets that look in her eyes, the one that says her family needs help, you don't really have a choice. Not if you want to keep sleeping in the same bed. Anyway, my name's Marcus Quinn, and I'm what most people would call a straightforward guy. 35 years old, methodical as hell, and I've built my whole life around solving problems the right way, with data, patience, and a plan that actually makes sense. While other guys my age are still figuring out whether they want to be grown-ups, I've got my shit together. I run my own IT consulting firm from home, I pay my bills on time, and I don't make promises I can't keep. Maybe that makes me boring, but boring pays the mortgage. Sienna, though? She's the complete opposite of everything I am, and that's exactly why we work. Where I'm quiet and calculated, she's this burst of energy that lights up every room she walks into. She's got this laugh that makes strangers smile, and she remembers everyone's birthday, including the mailman's kids. She works full-time at a marketing firm downtown, comes home with stories that make me laugh until my sides hurt, and somehow still has energy to worry about every single person in her family tree. And man, does she worry about Trevor. Trevor's her younger brother, 28 years old and still trying to find himself, which apparently involves a lot of couch surfing and big talk about business ideas that never quite materialize. He's been unemployed for over a year now, bouncing between friends' places and their mom's basement, always with some excuse about why the last opportunity didn't work out. The interview went great, but they went with someone internal. The startup was perfect, but the funding fell through. You know the type. So when Sienna came to me 3 months ago with that look, the one where she's already decided what needs to happen, but she's trying to make it sound like a suggestion, I knew exactly what was coming. Babe, she said, settling onto the couch next to me while I was reviewing client contracts. Trevor's having a really hard time right now. I didn't look up from my laptop. His roommate situation fell through, and mom's place is just, you know how small it is with dad's medical equipment taking up the living room. I saved the document I was working on, because I could tell this conversation was going to require my full attention. I was thinking. She paused, and I could practically hear the gears turning. We've got that guest room downstairs that's just sitting empty. And there it was. I closed the laptop and looked at her, taking in those big brown eyes that had convinced me to do stupider things than let her unemployed brother crash at our place. You want Trevor to move in. Just temporarily, she said quickly, until he gets back on his feet. He's got some interviews lined up, and there's this networking event next week that could really open doors for him. The thing is, I'd heard about Trevor's interviews and networking events before. They had a funny way of turning into more excuses and longer stretches of unemployment. But when I looked at Sienna, really looked at her, I could see how much this meant to her. She'd been raised to believe family comes first, no matter what, and her little brother struggling while we had extra space was eating at her. Plus, and I'll be honest about this, it wasn't like we couldn't afford it. The house we lived in, I owned it outright. Bought it 5 years before I even met Sienna, back when I was still a bachelor with more money than sense and a gut feeling that real estate in our neighborhood was about to explode. Turned out I was right. The place had nearly doubled in value since then. It's a nice setup, actually. A duplex with 2 separate entrances, completely self-contained units. Sienna and I live in the top floor, which has been renovated into this open-concept space with huge windows and a kitchen that makes her happy. The bottom floor is smaller but totally functional. 1 bedroom, 1 bath, living area, kitchenette. I've been renting it out to grad students mostly, decent income and minimal hassle. How long is temporarily? I asked. A couple months, max. Just until he saves up enough for a security deposit somewhere else. I rubbed my temples, already knowing what my answer was going to be. And he understands this isn't a free ride? He needs to contribute something. Groceries, utilities, whatever. Sienna's face lit up like I'd just told her Christmas was coming early. Of course, Trevor's not looking for a handout. He just needs a stable place to regroup. Famous last words, right? So that's how Trevor Quinn-in-law ended up moving into our downstairs unit with 2 duffel bags, a gaming setup that probably cost more than most people's cars, and what I would soon learn was a completely warped sense of how the world owed him something. But at the time, watching Sienna hug me like I'd just solved world hunger, I felt pretty good about the decision. I mean, how hard could it be? The guy needed a place to crash, we had the space, and it would make my wife happy. Simple math. Yeah, well, turns out some equations are a lot more complicated than they look on paper. Looking back, I should have seen the red flags from day one. But you know how it is when you're trying to be the good guy. You ignore the little warning bells going off in your head and chalk everything up to adjustment period. That's exactly what I did with Trevor, and man, was that a mistake. My name's Marcus Quinn, and I'm what most people would call a straightforward guy. 35 years old, methodical as hell, and I've built my whole life around solving problems the right way, with data, patience, and a plan that actually makes sense. While other guys my age are still figuring out whether they want to be grown-ups, I've got my shit together. I run my own IT consulting firm from home, I pay my bills on time, and I don't make promises I can't keep. Maybe that makes me boring, but boring pays the mortgage. Sienna, though? She's the complete opposite of everything I am, and that's exactly why we work. Where I'm quiet and calculated, she's this burst of energy that lights up every room she walks into. She's got this laugh that makes strangers smile, and she remembers everyone's birthday, including the mailman's kids. She works full-time at a marketing firm downtown, comes home with stories that make me laugh until my sides hurt, and somehow still has energy to worry about every single person in her family tree. And man, does she worry about Trevor. Trevor's her younger brother, 28 years old and still trying to find himself, which apparently involves a lot of couch surfing and big talk about business ideas that never quite materialize. He's been unemployed for over a year now, bouncing between friends' places and their mom's basement, always with some excuse about why the last opportunity didn't work out. The interview went great, but they went with someone internal. The startup was perfect, but the funding fell through. You know the type. So when Sienna came to me 3 months ago with that look, the one where she's already decided what needs to happen, but she's trying to make it sound like a suggestion, I knew exactly what was coming. "Babe," she said, settling onto the couch next to me while I was reviewing client contracts. "Trevor's having a really hard time right now." I didn't look up from my laptop. His roommate situation fell through, and mom's place is just, you know how small it is with dad's medical equipment taking up the living room. I saved the document I was working on, because I could tell this conversation was going to require my full attention. I was thinking. She paused, and I could practically hear the gears turning. "We've got that guest room downstairs that's just sitting empty." And there it was. I closed the laptop and looked at her, taking in those big brown eyes that had convinced me to do stupider things than let her unemployed brother crash at our place. "You want Trevor to move in. Just temporarily," she said quickly, "until he gets back on his feet. He's got some interviews lined up, and there's this networking event next week that could really open doors for him." The thing is, I'd heard about Trevor's interviews and networking events before. They had a funny way of turning into more excuses and longer stretches of unemployment. But when I looked at Sienna, really looked at her, I could see how much this meant to her. She'd been raised to believe family comes first, no matter what, and her little brother struggling while we had extra space was eating at her. Plus, and I'll be honest about this, it wasn't like we couldn't afford it. The house we lived in, I owned it outright. Bought it 5 years before I even met Sienna, back when I was still a bachelor with more money than sense and a gut feeling that real estate in our neighborhood was about to explode. Turned out I was right. The place had nearly doubled in value since then. It's a nice setup, actually. A duplex with 2 separate entrances, completely self-contained units. Sienna and I live in the top floor, which has been renovated into this open-concept space with huge windows and a kitchen that makes her happy. The bottom floor is smaller but totally functional. 1 bedroom, 1 bath, living area, kitchenette. I'd been renting it out to grad students mostly, decent income and minimal hassle. "How long is temporarily?" I asked. "A couple months, max. Just until he saves up enough for a security deposit somewhere else." I rubbed my temples, already knowing what my answer was going to be. And he understands this isn't a free ride? He needs to contribute something, groceries, utilities, whatever. Sienna's face lit up like I'd just told her Christmas was coming early. Of course, Trevor's not looking for a handout. He just needs a stable place to regroup. Famous last words, right? So that's how Trevor Quinn-in-law ended up moving into our downstairs unit with 2 duffel bags, a gaming setup that probably cost more than most people's cars, and what I would soon learn was a completely warped sense of how the world owed him something. But at the time, watching Sienna hug me like I'd just solved world hunger, I felt pretty good about the decision. I mean, how hard could it be? The guy needed a place to crash, we had the space, and it would make my wife happy. Simple math. Yeah, well, turns out some equations are a lot more complicated than they look on paper. You know that feeling when you're watching a pot of water and you can see the first tiny bubbles starting to form at the bottom? That's exactly what those first few months with Trevor felt like. Everything looked calm on the surface, but underneath, something was definitely heating up. The guy had settled into our place like he owned it, and I mean that literally. By month 2, Trevor had basically transformed the downstairs unit into his personal gaming cave. The place reeked of energy drinks and whatever microwave garbage he'd been living on, and I swear he hadn't opened a window since he moved in. But hey, as long as he kept to his space and didn't cause any real problems, I figured I could deal with the occasional whiff of eau de bachelor pad drifting up through the vents. What really started getting under my skin was the way he'd begun treating the whole property like his personal kingdom. I'd come home from client meetings to find his friends' cars parked in our driveway. Not just 1 or 2, but sometimes 4 or 5 beat-up sedans and pickup trucks taking up every available spot. And these weren't quick visits either. These guys would roll up around noon and still be there when I was trying to go to bed at 11. The first time it happened, I gave Trevor the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he'd forgotten to mention he was having people over. So I went downstairs and knocked on his door, trying to keep things friendly. Hey, Trevor, just wanted to let you know your friends are blocking the driveway. Sienna's going to need to get out for work in the morning. He answered the door holding a controller, barely glancing away from whatever game was blasting on the TV behind him. Oh yeah, my bad. We're just hanging out for a bit. They'll move their cars later. Later turned out to be 2 in the morning, and only after I'd sent him a text threatening to call a tow truck. But that was just the beginning. Pretty soon, Trevor started acting like he was the unofficial host of our entire property. He'd give his buddies tours of the upstairs unit when Sienna and I weren't home. I only found out because our neighbor mentioned seeing a bunch of young guys coming out of our front door while we were at work. When I confronted him about it, he shrugged it off. Relax, man. I was just showing them the layout. It's not like they stole anything. That's not the point, Trevor. This is our private space. You can't just... Our space. He cut me off with this smirk that made my jaw clench. I thought you were all about sharing and helping family out. That's when I started noticing the little power plays. Trevor would crank his music up loud enough that we could hear it upstairs, then act all surprised when I asked him to turn it down. Oh, sorry, bro didn't realize how thin these walls were. He'd use our outdoor grill without asking, leaving it dirty and running the propane tank empty. When I mentioned it, he'd say something like, I figured since we're all family here, we could share resources. The worst part was how he'd position himself as the man of the house whenever his friends were around. I'd be coming back from the grocery store, arms full of bags, and there'd be Trevor holding court on our front porch with 3 or 4 of his unemployed buddies, talking loud and gesturing like he was running some kind of business meeting. Yeah, this is my spot, I heard him tell one guy. My sister hooked me up with this sweet setup. The landlord's pretty chill too. Landlord. Like I was some random property manager instead of the guy who owned the place and was letting him live there rent-free. I started working longer hours just to avoid dealing with him. My home office, which used to be my sanctuary, became this tense space where I'd find myself listening for footsteps on the stairs or voices in the backyard. Sienna noticed I was more irritable than usual, but every time she asked about it, I'd just say everything was fine. What was I supposed to tell her? That her brother was slowly driving me insane with his entitled attitude and complete lack of respect for boundaries? The breaking point started building around month 3, when Trevor apparently decided that having friends over during the day wasn't enough. He began throwing what he called networking events on weekday nights. These weren't professional meetups. They were basically parties disguised as business gatherings. Guys in their 20s and 30s showing up with cases of beer, talking about cryptocurrency and disrupting industries, while music thumped until midnight. I tried talking to Sienna about it, but she kept making excuses. He's trying to build connections, she'd say. Networking is important for entrepreneurs. When I pointed out that real networking usually happened at coffee shops or conference rooms, not in residential neighborhoods with noise ordinances, she'd get that defensive look in her eyes. He's making an effort, Marcus. Isn't that what we wanted? What I wanted was for her brother to show some basic respect for the fact that he was living in someone else's house. What I wanted was to come home to peace and quiet, not a college dorm atmosphere. What I wanted was for Trevor to acknowledge that this arrangement was a favor, not an entitlement. But what I got instead was Trevor treating our home like his personal clubhouse, complete with the attitude that anyone who had a problem with it just didn't understand his entrepreneurial vision. Yeah, I understood his vision all right. The question was, how long was I going to let him turn my life upside down before I did something about it? You know what's worse than someone straight up insulting you to your face? When they do it with a smile and pretend it's all just good-natured ribbing. That's exactly the game Trevor started playing around month 4. And let me tell you, the guy was a real artist when it came to passive-aggressive bullshit. It started small, like most toxic behavior does. Little comments here and there that you could almost convince yourself weren't meant to be hurtful. Almost. I was in the kitchen one morning, making coffee before a client call, when Trevor wandered upstairs in his pajamas. Yeah, he'd started treating our living space like an extension of his apartment. He grabbed a mug from our cabinet and poured himself coffee from the pot I'd just made. "Morning, Marcus," he said, stretching and yawning like he owned the place. "Must be nice having such a flexible schedule. I mean, working from home, setting your own hours, no real boss breathing down your neck." I looked up from my laptop where I was reviewing the quarterly security audit I'd been hired to conduct for a major hospital system. "It's not exactly a vacation, Trevor. I put in 60-hour weeks sometimes." He laughed. Not a mean laugh, but not a friendly one either. 60 hours of what, though? Sitting in your pajamas answering emails? Come on, man, we both know that's not the same as real work. Real work. Like sitting in your underwear playing Call of Duty for 12 hours straight was some kind of career move. But I bit my tongue, finished my coffee, and went to my office. Sienna was already at her marketing job downtown, pulling actual 60-hour weeks in meetings and presentations, and I wasn't about to start drama over Trevor's ignorant comments about my profession. The jabs got more frequent after that. Trevor had this way of making everything sound like a joke while landing these little cuts that were clearly meant to get under my skin. When his friends were over, which was basically every other day now, he'd really put on a show. "Hey, guys, meet my brother-in-law Marcus," he said one afternoon when I came home to find 4 dudes I'd never seen before raiding our refrigerator. "He's got the dream set up. Works from home, wife pays half the bills, no commute stress. Living the cushy life, right bro?" His buddies laughed, and I forced a smile while my blood pressure spiked. The thing that really got me wasn't just the implication that I was some kind of kept man, it was how wrong he had everything. I owned the house. I paid for the groceries they were eating. I covered the utilities, the insurance, the property taxes, all of it. But somehow Trevor had constructed this fantasy where I was the one getting a free ride. "Yeah, real cushy," I said, grabbing a water bottle and heading back upstairs before I said something I'd regret. But Trevor wasn't done. Over the next few weeks, the comments got bolder and more pointed. He'd make cracks about trophy husbands when Sienna was around, always with this. Then looked directly at me while his friend snickered. The worst part was how he'd frame it all as concern for his sister. "I just worry about Sienna sometimes," he told one of his buddies while I was in earshot, organizing client files at the kitchen table. "She's such a hard worker, you know? Always has been. And now she's supporting this whole household while Marcus does his computer thing from home. I mean, I'm grateful he's letting me crash here, but still, letting him crash here. Like it was my generous decision to allow Sienna's husband to live in his own house." I started documenting these conversations in my head, not because I was planning anything, but because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Here was a guy who hadn't held a job in over a year, living rent-free in my property, eating my food, using my utilities, and somehow he'd convinced himself that I was the deadbeat in this scenario. The breaking point came during one of his networking events, which by this point had evolved into straight-up parties that went until 2 in the morning. I was trying to work late on a project deadline when the music started thumping downstairs. Around 11, I went down to ask him to keep it down and found Trevor in full performer mode, surrounded by his usual crew of wannabe entrepreneurs and gaming buddies. "Oh hey everyone, here's Marcus," Trevor called out when he saw me. "The man of the house." Well, one of them anyway. He threw his arm around my shoulder like we were best friends. "Marcus here has got it all figured out. Beautiful wife with a great job, nice house, and he gets to work in his pajamas all day. Must be nice to have married up, right buddy?" His friends laughed, but I could see something in their eyes, a mix of amusement and discomfort, like they knew Trevor was pushing it but didn't want to call him out. One guy, someone I'd never seen before, actually looked embarrassed for me. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice level, "I bought this house 5 years before I met Sienna, and I've been running my own business for 8 years now, so I'd say I'm doing all right." The room got quiet for about 3 seconds before Trevor jumped back in with his biggest, fakest smile yet. "Oh, absolutely, man. I didn't mean anything by it. You know me, just giving you a hard time. Brothers-in-law, right? We can joke around." But the damage was done. Not to me. I knew exactly who I was and what I'd accomplished. The damage was to whatever thin veneer of respect I'd been maintaining for this guy who was living in my house, eating my food, and apparently telling anyone who'd listen that I was some kind of freeloader who'd lucked into a good situation. As I walked back upstairs, I could hear Trevor trying to get the party atmosphere back on track, but something had shifted. Maybe it was the way I'd responded, calm and factual instead of defensive. Maybe it was the realization that his little jokes weren't as harmless as he pretended they were. Either way, I went to bed that night knowing things were about to change. Because respect isn't something you can joke away, and patience isn't unlimited, even mine. Some people say you can feel trouble coming like a storm front rolling in. For me, that Sunday morning felt perfectly normal right up until the moment everything went to hell in a handbasket. I'd gotten up early, around 7, to catch up on some client work before the week started. Sienna was still sleeping. She'd been putting in crazy hours at the marketing firm, working on some big campaign launch, and weekends were her only real chance to recharge. I made my coffee extra quiet, grabbed my laptop, and settled into the kitchen table where I could spread out some paperwork. That's when I heard the scraping. At first, I figured Trevor was just moving around downstairs, maybe rearranging his gaming setup again. The guy changed his furniture configuration like other people change their underwear. But this wasn't the usual bumping around. This was deliberate, purposeful noise, like someone was dragging heavy stuff across the floor. I tried to ignore it. Really, I did. But after 20 minutes of constant scraping, banging, and what sounded like furniture being shoved around, I couldn't concentrate on the network security proposal I was supposed to finish by Monday. So I saved my work, grabbed my coffee mug, and headed downstairs to see what the hell was going on. The sight that greeted me when I walked into Trevor's unit made my jaw drop. He'd moved our couch, the nice leather sectional that had come with the furnished apartment, over to the opposite wall. Our coffee table was now positioned like some kind of conference table in the center of the room, with dining chairs arranged around it like he was setting up for a board meeting. And Trevor was standing in the middle of it all, talking loudly into his phone while gesturing around the space like he was showing off his executive office. "Yeah, this place is perfect for what we're planning," he was saying into his phone, pacing back and forth while I stood there in the doorway. "It's got great natural light, plenty of space for equipment, and the location is prime for attracting the right demographic." I cleared my throat. "Trevor." He held up one finger at me, actually held up his finger to shush me in my own house, and kept talking. "The current situation is just temporary, you know? I'm working on transitioning this into a proper business space. My sister's husband is pretty chill about letting me make changes." My sister's husband. Not Marcus. Not the homeowner. Just some guy who was pretty chill about his property being rearranged without permission. And honestly, Trevor continued, his voice getting louder and more animated, "This place will be mine eventually anyway. Sienna just needs to realize she's married to a leech who can't provide for her the way she deserves. Once she figures that out, this whole setup becomes a lot simpler, if you know what I mean." That's when something inside me just snapped. I mean, I'd put up with months of disrespect, passive-aggressive comments, unauthorized parties, and having my home treated like a frat house. I'd bitten my tongue when he made jokes about my work, when he acted like he was doing me a favor by living there, when he talked about me like I was some kind of deadbeat husband. But hearing him plan out loud how he was going to take over my property after my marriage fell apart, that was the line. Trevor, I said, loud enough that he couldn't ignore me this time. He turned around with this annoyed expression, like I was interrupting something important. Dude, can you give me like 5 minutes? I'm in the middle of a business call. Business call, I repeated, looking around at the rearranged furniture. Is that what you call planning to steal someone's house? His face went red. What are you talking about, man? I heard what you said. I stepped into the room, and I'll be honest, I was madder than I'd been in years. About this place being yours eventually. About Sienna needing to realize she married a leech. Did I get that right? Trevor ended his call and shoved his phone in his pocket, but instead of backing down or apologizing, he puffed up his chest like he was ready for a fight. Look, Marcus, I don't know what you think you heard, but I know exactly what I heard. I stayed calm, which seemed to piss him off even more. And I know what I'm looking at. You've moved my furniture around, you're talking about turning my property into your business space, and you're planning for a future where you somehow end up with my house. Your house. Trevor laughed, but it wasn't a funny laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes right before someone says something really stupid. Dude, get real. This is Sienna's house too, and she's the one actually contributing to this household. You're just some freeloading computer nerd who got lucky enough to marry above his league. And there it was. Months of barely contained hostility, all spilling out at once. You think I'm freeloading? I asked, genuinely curious to hear his logic. I know you are. Trevor was practically shouting now. You sit around in your pajamas all day, playing on your computer while your wife goes to a real job and pays real bills. You're a pathetic, lazy, broke man who depends on his wife for everything. He stepped closer to me, his face flushed and his fists clenched like he was thinking about taking a swing. And you know what? Sienna's starting to see it too. She deserves better than some loser who can't even afford his own place. So yeah, when she finally wises up and kicks your ass to the curb, someone needs to be here to take care of her. Someone needs to be the man of this house. I stared at him for a long moment, taking in his red face, his aggressive posture, his absolute conviction that he was right about everything. And then I did something that clearly wasn't what he expected. I laughed. Not a mean laugh, not an angry laugh, but a genuine, from-the-belly laugh that made Trevor's face go from red to purple. Get out of our house, he screamed, completely losing it now. This isn't your place. You don't belong here. Get out. I wiped tears from my eyes and looked at this 28-year-old man having a complete meltdown in my living room, surrounded by my furniture, screaming at me to get out of my own house. Try to make me, I said quietly. That's when Trevor made the biggest mistake of his life. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. You know that moment in movies where the bad guy thinks he's got the hero cornered, but the hero's got an ace up his sleeve? Yeah, well, Trevor calling the cops on me in my own house was about to become one of those moments. Except this wasn't Hollywood, and I wasn't about to deliver some cheesy one-liner. I was just going to let the facts speak for themselves. After Trevor dialed 911, he started pacing around the living room like a caged animal, talking loud enough for the dispatcher to hear every word. Yes, I need police at 847 Maple Street. There's a man in my sister's house who's refusing to leave. He's being aggressive and threatening, and I need him removed immediately. I just stood there, sipping my coffee and watching this train wreck unfold. Trevor kept glancing at me like he expected me to panic or run upstairs to pack a bag or something. Instead, I walked calmly to the kitchen drawer where I keep all my important documents. You know, the boring adult stuff that apparently Trevor had never learned to deal with, and pulled out a manila folder. The police are on their way, Trevor announced, like he'd just checkmate me in chess. They're going to remove you from this property, and then we can finally get this situation sorted out properly. Sounds good, I said, flipping through the folder to make sure everything was in order. I'll just wait here. That seemed to throw him off a little. You're not even going to try to explain yourself? Or call Sienna to back up your story? What story? I asked. That I live here? That I own this house? Why would I need to call anyone to back up facts? Trevor's face scrunched up in confusion, but before he could respond, we heard car doors slamming outside. 2 patrol cars had pulled up in front of the house, and I could see 4 officers walking up the front path through the window. Good, Trevor muttered, suddenly looking more confident. Now you'll see what happens when you try to intimidate people in their own homes. I opened the front door before the officers could knock. Good morning, officers. I'm Marcus Quinn. I believe someone called about a disturbance. The lead officer, a woman who looked to be in her 40s with sergeant stripes on her sleeve, stepped forward. I'm Sergeant Martinez. We received a call about a trespassing incident. Are you the homeowner or the complainant? I'm the homeowner, I said calmly. This is my property. Trevor practically jumped in front of me. No, officers, don't listen to him. This is my sister's house, and this man is refusing to leave. His name is Marcus, and he's been living here illegally. I want him removed immediately. Sergeant Martinez looked back and forth between us, clearly trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Okay, let's slow down here. Sir, she said, addressing Trevor. You're saying this is your sister's house. That's right. Sienna Quinn. She lives here with her husband, but he doesn't have any legal right to the property. I'm the one who's supposed to be staying here. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. This guy was digging his own grave so fast I was starting to feel bad for him. Almost. And you, sir, Sergeant Martinez turned to me. You're claiming to be the homeowner? I'm not claiming anything, I said, holding up my manila folder. I can prove it. One of the other officers, a younger guy with Hale on his name tag, stepped forward. What kind of proof do you have? I opened the folder and pulled out the first document. Well, here's the deed to the property, filed with the county recorder's office 5 years ago. I handed it to Officer Hale. Marcus Alexander Quinn, sole owner. No joint ownership, no mortgage, bought and paid for in full. Trevor's eyes went wide. That's not possible, Sienna said. Here are the property tax records for the last 5 years. I continued, pulling out more papers. All paid by me, all showing me as the sole owner. Here's the homeowner's insurance policy, also in my name. Here are the utility bills, gas, electric, water, internet, all in my name, all paid by me for the last 5 years. Officer Hale was flipping through the documents, his eyebrows getting higher with each page. These all look legitimate, he told Sergeant Martinez. Property deed, tax records, insurance documents, all showing Marcus Quinn as the owner. But that can't be right. Trevor was starting to sound desperate now. Sienna told me this was their house. She said they lived here together. We do live here together, I said patiently. She's my wife. But I owned this house before we got married, and I never changed the title. Which, by the way, is completely legal and pretty common. Sergeant Martinez studied the deed more carefully. Mr. Quinn, this document shows you purchased this property in 2020. When did you get married? 2 years ago, I said. 2023. And sir, she turned to Trevor, when did you move into this property? Trevor was looking around frantically, like he was hoping someone would jump out and tell him this was all a prank. 4 months ago, but Sienna invited me. She said I could stay here, in the downstairs unit, I clarified, which I was renting out before Trevor needed a place to stay. I allowed him to live there rent-free as a favor to my wife. Officer Hale handed the documents back to me. So let me get this straight. You own the house, you live here with your wife, and you've been letting her brother stay in the downstairs unit. That's correct. And you, he looked at Trevor, called 911 to report the homeowner as a trespasser in his own house. The color drained from Trevor's face as the reality of the situation finally started to sink in. I didn't know. Sienna never told me. Told you what? Sergeant Martinez asked. That her husband owned the house they live in. She always said our house when she talked about it. Trevor said weakly. I thought they were renting together, or maybe she owned it, or, I don't know, I just never thought. You never thought to ask, I said quietly. You just assumed. Sergeant Martinez closed her notepad and looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. Mr. Quinn, do you want this man removed from your property? I glanced at Trevor, who was now slumped against the wall looking like someone had just told him Santa Claus wasn't real. For months of his arrogance, his disrespect, his parties, his plans to take over my house, all of it based on a completely false understanding of who owned what. Yes, I said simply. I'd like him to leave. She turned to Trevor. Sir, you have 30 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you're not gone by then, you'll be arrested for trespassing. Trevor just stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. 30 minutes? But all my stuff, my gaming setup. 30 minutes, she repeated firmly. I'd suggest you start packing. Watching a grown man's entire reality crumble in real time is something I wouldn't wish on anyone, but I'll be damned if Trevor didn't deserve every second of what happened next. After Sergeant Martinez gave him the 30-minute ultimatum, Trevor just stood there staring at the officers like he was waiting for someone to tell him this was all a misunderstanding. When nobody did, when the reality finally sank in that he'd just called the cops on the actual homeowner of the property he'd been living in rent-free, something inside him seemed to break. "This is bullshit," he exploded, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "You cops don't know what you're talking about. Those documents could be fake. Anyone can print up some papers and claim they own a house." Officer Hale, who'd been pretty patient up to this point, took a step forward. "Sir, these are official county records with raised seals and filing numbers. Would you like us to call the recorder's office to verify them?" "Yes," Trevor shouted. "Call them. Call everyone. Because this is insane. Sienna would never let me live somewhere that wasn't hers. She wouldn't do that to me." I felt a pang of something, not quite sympathy, but maybe pity, watching him fall apart. The guy had built his entire understanding of his living situation on assumptions, and now those assumptions were being stripped away layer by layer. "Trevor," I said quietly, "Sienna didn't lie to you. She calls it our house because we're married and we live here together. That doesn't mean she owns it." "But she pays bills," he said desperately. "She told me she pays bills. She pays for groceries sometimes. She'll grab dinner on her way home. She bought the shower curtain in our bathroom last month. Yeah, she contributes to our household." I shrugged. That's what married couples do. Sergeant Martinez was checking her watch. "Sir, you now have 27 minutes to gather your belongings." I suggest. "No," Trevor cut her off. "I'm not going anywhere. You can't just throw someone out on the street with no notice. There are tenant rights. There are laws." That's when Officer Hale pulled out his own notepad. "Actually, sir, since you haven't been paying rent and you don't have a lease agreement, you're considered a guest in Mr. Quinn's home. And guests can be asked to leave at any time." Trevor's face went through about 6 different shades of red and purple. "Guest? Guest? I've been living here for 4 months. I have mail delivered here. I changed my address with the DMV. None of that establishes tenancy without a rental agreement," Sergeant Martinez explained. "If you'd like to dispute this, you can contact a lawyer, but right now you need to leave the property." That's when Trevor completely lost it. "This is fucking ridiculous," he screamed, loud enough that I saw our neighbor Mrs. Patterson peek out her front window. "I'm not some random stranger. I'm family. Sienna invited me here. She wanted me to stay. And now her asshole husband is throwing me out because he's jealous that I see right." The officers exchanged glances, and I could tell their patience was wearing thin. People who scream at cops generally don't have a good day, and Trevor was well on his way to making this situation much worse for himself. "Sir," Officer Hale said firmly, "you need to calm down and start packing your belongings." "I'm not calming down, and I'm not packing shit. This guy," he pointed at me with a shaking finger, "has been lying to everyone about who he is and what he owns. He's been pretending to be some successful businessman when he's really just a freeloading piece of shit who married my sister for her money." I couldn't help myself. I actually laughed out loud. "Trevor, your sister works at a marketing firm. She makes decent money, but she's not exactly Oprah Winfrey." "She makes more than you," he shot back. "Maybe," I said with a shrug. "I honestly don't know. We don't really compare paychecks. But I bought this house with money I made before I ever met her, so I'm not sure what your point is." Trevor's face was doing this twitching thing, like his brain was trying to process information that didn't fit with his worldview. "You're lying. You have to be lying. Because if you're not lying, that means you've been wrong about pretty much everything." I finished for him. "That means Sienna lied to me," he whispered. "No, Trevor. That means you made assumptions and never bothered to ask questions." Sergeant Martinez checked her watch again. 22 minutes, sir." And that's when Trevor really went off the deep end. He started ranting about how this was all a conspiracy, how I'd probably forged the documents, how Sienna was being manipulated and controlled, how the cops were taking my side because I looked the part of a homeowner better than he did. It was like watching someone have a complete mental breakdown in real time. "You think you're so smart," he snarled at me. "You think you've got everyone fooled with your quiet little act and your fancy paperwork. But I know what you really are. You're a parasite. You're a leech. And when Sienna finds out what kind of man she really married, when she sees how you treated her brother, she's going to leave your ass so fast it'll make your head spin. I looked at him, really looked at him, standing there in my living room, surrounded by my furniture, screaming threats at me while police officers waited to escort him off my property. And I felt something I hadn't expected, genuine sadness. Not for myself, but for him. Trevor, I said quietly, I hope you figure out what you want to do with your life. But you can't do it here anymore. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the exact second when the fight went out of him. His shoulders sagged, his face crumpled, and suddenly he looked less like an angry young man and more like a scared kid who'd just realized he was completely alone. 18 minutes, Sergeant Martinez said gently. Trevor nodded and headed toward the stairs that led down to his unit, moving like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. The reality had finally hit him. He was about to be homeless, and it was nobody's fault but his own. The sound of Sienna's car pulling into the driveway 20 minutes later was like a starter's pistol going off. I was standing in the kitchen, watching through the window as Trevor loaded the last of his gaming equipment into his buddy's pickup truck when I heard her Honda Civic's engine shut off. She'd been at her friend Jessica's place for a girls' brunch, one of those monthly traditions where they caught up on life over mimosas and complained about their jobs. I'd texted her a simple message. Had to ask Trevor to leave. We'll explain when you get home. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, just the facts. But judging by the way she slammed her car door and marched up the front walkway, I could tell she'd been stewing about it the entire drive home. Marcus, she called out before she even made it through the front door. What the hell happened? Trevor just called me crying, saying you had him arrested. I took a deep breath. This was the conversation I'd been dreading for 4 months. He wasn't arrested. I asked him to leave, and when he refused, he called the police on me. In my own house. Sienna stopped in the middle of the living room, her purse still slung over her shoulder, staring at me like I'd just told her I'd burned down an orphanage. You called the cops on my brother? No, honey. He called the cops on me. He told them I was trespassing in his sister's house and demanded they remove me from the property. Her face went through several expressions at once. Confusion, disbelief, anger. That doesn't make any sense. Why would he do that? So I told her. Everything. The months of disrespect, the passive-aggressive comments about my work, the unauthorized parties, the way he'd started treating our home like his personal kingdom. I told her about finding him rearranging our furniture that morning, about overhearing his phone call where he talked about the house eventually being his after she realized she'd married a leech. With each detail, I watched Sienna's face change. The anger slowly drained away, replaced by something that looked like horror mixed with embarrassment. He said, "What about you being a leech?" she whispered. Among other things. He seemed to think I was some kind of freeloader who'd married you for financial support. He had no idea I owned this house. Sienna sank onto the couch, her hands covering her face. Oh my God, Marcus. I never told him you own the house. I always called it ours because we live here together. I never thought about how that might sound to someone else. I know, and I never made a big deal about the legal ownership because it didn't matter to us. But it mattered to Trevor, apparently. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. You embarrassed my brother. You had him thrown out by the police in front of the neighbors. Couldn't you have just talked to me first? And there it was, the reaction I'd been expecting but hoping wouldn't come. Even after everything I'd just told her, even knowing what Trevor had said and done, her first instinct was still to protect him. Sienna, I tried talking to you about his behavior for months. Every time I brought up the parties, the noise, the way he was treating our home, you made excuses for him. You said he was trying, that he was networking, that he just needed time to find his path. But calling the police. I didn't call the police. The words came out louder than I'd intended, and Sienna flinched. I took a breath and lowered my voice. He called them. On me. In my own house. After telling his friend on the phone that this place would be his once you realized you'd married a loser. We stared at each other across the living room, and I could see her trying to process everything. The woman I'd married was smart, logical, fair-minded, but she was also fiercely loyal to her family, sometimes to a fault. I didn't know, she said finally. I didn't know he felt that way about you. I didn't know he thought. I never meant for any of this to happen. I know you didn't. But it did happen. And we need to figure out how we're going to move forward from here. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house. Sienna had left early for work without saying goodbye, something she hadn't done since our second date 3 years ago. Her coffee mug was in the sink, rinsed but not put away, and there was a note on the counter. Need time to think. We'll talk tonight. I stared at that note for a solid 5 minutes, trying to figure out if I was supposed to feel guilty or vindicated. Mostly, I just felt tired. After my first cup of coffee, I decided to survey the damage downstairs. Trevor had cleared out fast, but he'd left behind more than just dust bunnies and empty energy drink cans. My home office, which shared a wall with his gaming setup, looked like a tornado had hit it. Papers were scattered across the floor, client contracts, tax documents, stuff I'd spent years organizing. My second monitor, a nice 27-inch display I'd bought specifically for spreadsheet work, had a spider web crack running right down the middle. The Ethernet cable that ran along the baseboards had been yanked out of the wall, leaving a gaping hole in the drywall. But the real kicker was my filing cabinet. The locked drawer where I kept backup drives and sensitive client data had been pried open, and everything inside was gone. Not just missing, gone. Trevor had taken my backup drives when he left. I called the non-emergency police line and filed a report. Officer Hale, the same guy from yesterday, came out to take photos and document everything. Looks like he was pretty pissed off, he said, surveying the wreckage. You want to press charges for the property damage? Yeah, I said. I think I do. What about the missing data drives? Definitely pressing charges for those. They contain confidential client information. That's not just theft. It's potentially a data breach that could destroy my business. The paperwork took 2 hours. By the time Officer Hale left, I had case numbers for vandalism, theft, and destruction of property. I also had a migraine and the growing realization that Trevor's tantrum was going to cost me thousands of dollars in repairs and replacement equipment. I spent the rest of the day calling clients to explain that there might be a security issue with their data. Most were understanding, but 2 of them immediately terminated their contracts. Can't say I blamed them. If someone told me my accountant's files had been stolen by an angry relative, I'd probably find a new accountant too. Sienna came home around 7 with Chinese takeout and red eyes that suggested she'd been crying at some point during the day. We ate in silence for the first 10 minutes, both of us picking at our food like we were defusing bombs instead of eating lo mein. I called my mom, she said finally. Told her what happened. How'd that go? She said, Trevor's been telling everyone you were unemployed and living off me. Sienna's voice was flat, emotionless. Apparently, that's been his story for months. The whole family thinks I'm supporting a deadbeat husband. I set down my chopsticks. And now I have to call everyone back and explain that my brother is a liar who vandalized my husband's office and stole his work files. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I enabled this. I made excuses for him when I should have listened to you. We both made mistakes, I said. I should have been clearer about boundaries from the beginning. No, she shook her head firmly. You were being generous to my family, and I let my brother take advantage of that generosity. This is on me. That night, Sienna started looking up therapists online. I need to figure out why I keep making excuses for people who don't deserve them, she said. It was a start. 6 months later, I'm sitting in the same kitchen where this whole mess started, watching the steam rise from my coffee mug and thinking about how much can change when you finally stop letting other people write the story of your life. The small claims court ruled in my favor back in October. Trevor owed me $3,200 for the damaged equipment and stolen data drives. Not that I've seen a dime of it. Last I heard from Sienna's mom, he'd moved to Phoenix and was starting fresh with some new get-rich-quick scheme involving cryptocurrency and social media marketing. Some people never learn, but that's not my problem anymore. The downstairs unit is rented again, but this time to a graduate student named Amy who studies marine biology at the university. She's quiet, pays her rent on time, and her biggest social gathering so far has been a study group of 4 people who stayed until the radical hour of 9 p.m. After Trevor, living with Amy feels like a goddamn vacation. I converted part of the basement into a proper home office, soundproofed walls, dedicated electrical circuits, and a security system that would make Fort Knox jealous. My client base is actually bigger now than it was before the Trevor disaster. Turns out, when you handle a data breach incident with complete transparency and professionalism, people notice. Word spread that I was the kind of IT consultant who took security seriously, even when it meant eating some short-term losses. Go figure. But the real change happened upstairs, in the relationship between Sienna and me. Those first few weeks after Trevor left were rough as hell. Sienna felt guilty about not seeing her brother's behavior for what it was, and I felt like an asshole for letting the situation get so bad before I put my foot down. We had some fights, real fights, not the polite disagreements we'd had before. She accused me of never really trying to get along with Trevor. I pointed out that I'd been trying for 4 months while he systematically disrespected me and our home. The turning point came during one of our therapy sessions. Yeah, we went to couples counseling. Sienna had started seeing Dr. Rodriguez individually to work on her tendency to enable family members, and after a month, she asked if I'd come to a joint session. I need to understand why you never told me how bad things were getting, Dr. Rodriguez said to me during our 3rd session together. Sienna says you rarely complained directly about Trevor's behavior. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I guess I thought if I could just be patient enough, the situation would resolve itself. I didn't want to put Sienna in a position where she had to choose between her husband and her brother. But by not communicating your boundaries clearly, Dr. Rodriguez said, you created a situation where the choice became inevitable. She was right. I'd been so focused on being the understanding husband that I'd let Trevor walk all over both of us. And Sienna had been so focused on protecting her brother that she'd missed the signs that he was taking advantage of her generosity. We both handled it wrong, Sienna said during that session. But Marcus, you own this house. You've been supporting both of us financially, and I never even acknowledged that. I let Trevor think we were equals in this situation when we weren't. That was the conversation that changed everything. Not because we figured out who was right or wrong, but because we finally started being honest about what we each brought to the relationship and what we expected from each other. Sienna started paying half the mortgage, not because I asked her to, but because she wanted to contribute equally to something that was clearly going to be our long-term home. We opened a joint account for household expenses and started having monthly budget meetings. Boring as hell, but incredibly clarifying about our priorities and goals. More importantly, we established ground rules about family. Future house guests would have clear expectations, written agreements, and defined end dates. No more open-ended, temporary arrangements. No more assumptions about who pays for what or who makes decisions about our home. Trevor tried to contact Sienna a few times over the winter. Apologetic texts that started with, I've been thinking about what happened, and ended with requests for money or a place to stay. She didn't respond to any of them. He needs to figure out his own life, she told me after deleting the 5th message without reading it all the way through. I can't keep rescuing someone who doesn't want to be rescued. That might sound cold, but it wasn't. It was just realistic. Trevor was almost 30 years old, and every time his family bailed him out of a jam, they were teaching him that his actions didn't have real consequences. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is let them fail. These days, our Sunday mornings are peaceful again. Sienna makes pancakes while I read the news on my tablet. We talk about work, about the vacation we're planning for next year, about whether we want to renovate the kitchen or save up for a new car first. Normal couple stuff that feels impossibly luxurious after months of walking on eggshells around her volatile brother. Amy from downstairs occasionally joins us for Sunday dinner, which has become a tradition again. She's smart, funny, and respectful, everything a tenant should be. Last week, she brought homemade bread and helped Sienna fix the garbage disposal that had been acting up. It's amazing how much more pleasant it is to share your home with someone who appreciates being there. I still keep that manila folder of property documents in the kitchen drawer. Not because I'm expecting another challenge to my ownership, but because it reminds me of something important. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be shouted to be powerful. Sometimes you just need to wait patiently until the right moment to let facts speak for themselves. Trevor thought he could intimidate me, outlast me, or manipulate the situation until reality bent to match his delusions. But reality doesn't work that way. Houses belong to the people whose names are on the deeds. Respect belongs to the people who earn it. And peace belongs to the people who are willing to defend it, even when that defense requires difficult conversations and uncomfortable choices. I sip my coffee and watch Sienna reading a book in the living room, her feet tucked under her on the couch we bought together last month. The morning light streams through the windows of the house I own, in the neighborhood where I've built a life, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing exactly where you stand. Some guys need to prove their worth by making noise, demanding attention, or picking fights they can't win. Me? I'm perfectly content being the kind of man who owns his home, pays his bills, treats people with respect, and doesn't need to announce any of it to the world. Because when you've got your life together, really together, the proof is in how you live, not in what you say about it. And that's a truth that speaks for itself.